How many of you love a good origin story? Maybe the Marvel Cinematic Universe is where you go when you want a good drama about how Spider-Man came to be, or maybe you're more into sports, so a 30 for 30 on ESPN is more your thing. The thing about origin stories is they answer questions that have been left unanswered. They connect dots between the things that didn't seem related. They become like puzzle pieces to a bigger story. Several years ago, there was this thing that happened on ESPN during a basketball game. Syracuse was playing Duke, and Syracuse's head coach, Jim Boeheim, appeared to pee his pants. And if you know anything about the Duke fan base lost it. And on social media, they were making fun of Jim Boeheim. They were making really crude jokes until one person entered into the discussion and reminded them that Jim Boeheim is a prostate cancer survivor. And one of the consequences of his surgery, the inability to control his bladder. See, when you know the origin story, it fits the pieces together. For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about some of the questions that cause us to wonder, specifically how God and science relate to one another and how to still live with a sense of wonder and curiosity as we try to make sense of the world around us. As we wrap up this series, let's talk about Jenga. And to talk about Jenga, the thing about stories is that some parts are more important than others. I had a friend who just got started on the Marvel Cinematic Universe and began with Spider-Man. The first movie she watched announced Iron Man had died. She was totally lost. Was this some kind of joke? She wondered if she had started the movie in the middle and didn't realize it. And this part of the story was crucial to the whole thing. It's foundational. Now, there are other parts that weren't. Her missing out on some details surrounding a small side story didn't matter as much, but Iron Man dying, that's important. So what does this have to do with blocks? When you build a tower like this, there are certain parts that matter more to the structure than others. These pieces at the top, watch, I can take these off, not a big deal. These pieces in the middle, it's a little more hard to maneuver, but you can make them move, but you gotta be a lot more careful. But the bottom pieces, those are trickier. Why? Because they make up the foundation of the whole structure. And when you're building something, it's important to make sure what goes on the bottom is strong enough to hold everything else up, and that the necessary pieces are in place. In the same way, when it comes to our understanding of the world around us and when it comes to our faith, we want to make sure it's all built on something solid. We want to make sure the most important parts of the story are where they belong, so that when there are parts we encounter that might confuse us or not make a lot of sense, we can be sure we have a foundation for the tower and the story that holds, a foundation that makes sense, a foundation that we can build our faith on. The question we need to ask ourselves as we come to the end of this series is this: what foundation are you building your faith on? What holds up your faith? I think for a lot of us, it's a couple of things. Bible stories for sure. Here's what I mean by that. Our faith matters because the Bible tells us it should. We believe in Jesus because we trust what the Bible says about him. Maybe we're inspired by stories like David and Goliath or Noah and his ark. Maybe we've heard these stories for as long as we can remember, so we just assume we should believe them. For some of us, Bible stories make up the bottom layer of our tower. For others of us, if we're really honest, we'd admit we're here because it's just what other people expect us to do, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You may still be debating what you believe, but you know it's important to your mom or stepdad that you show up, so you show up for them. You've built your faith on the fact that other people say it's important, and it's not worth creating conflict by leaving your faith when you care so deeply about what they think. And for others of us, maybe the foundation of your faith was some sort of tragedy or trauma in your life where you felt like you needed God and it helped you through a really difficult time. But you've gotten through it, and now the more you think about it, the more you wonder if maybe faith was something that worked for a time, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you anymore. Maybe you feel like you've outgrown it. So for a lot of you, you go through high school with a faith either built on the stories in the Bible or traditions passed down by your family or circumstances that you've been through. And maybe that's worked for a long time. But here's the problem. What happens when that layer just doesn't hold up anymore? What happens when science bumps up against the stories we read in the Bible or the faith that's been passed down to us from other people? What happens when that bottom layer doesn't intersect with real life problems. If the building blocks of your faith are stories in the Bible or the people in your life, maybe even your whole family that say they believe, or maybe it's some tragedy that's happened to you, what happens when a classmate or a college professor or a boss starts pushing at those things that you believe for so long, or someone brings solid evidence to suggest that the stories you believe are false, or the traditional beliefs of the people who are closest to you and your family are outdated? Will you hit a crisis in your faith? Will the entire thing crumble? I think the odds are that it's possible. I think this is why 50% to 80% of students walk away from faith after high school, because their bottom row of blocks wasn't strong enough to handle what life threw at them. And if someone can disprove your foundation, all the faith you've built can come crashing down. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to be this way. Science isn't the enemy, even though it sometimes asks questions our faith doesn't have answers for. That's okay. We can build our faith on a foundation that will stand up to any argument or evidence that science presents. Even better, we can take what science says and not see it as a threat to the building blocks of our faith. We can build our faith on a foundation that has stood for 2,000 years and was actually intended to be the foundation of every Christian's faith from the beginning. So what should the bottom blocks be? What is our foundation? To find out, we have to look back in time at something that happened 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Jesus, the guy all of Christianity is based around, lived and then died by crucifixion on a Roman cross. He was killed for disrupting the systems and structures the Roman and religious authorities had in place. He claimed to be God and then said and did things that religious leaders couldn't imagine God would say or do, because Jesus lifted people that were normally looked down on. He concluded people normally excluded. He loved and valued people that were typically looked over and passed by. That wasn't how the world worked back then. And for the leaders who were used to having the power and the final say, they felt their position of power was threatened and Jesus had to be stopped. So they made a plan to arrest him, have him beaten, and then killed. The crazy thing about it is Jesus didn't put up a fight. He went into Jerusalem when he knew there were plots made to have him arrested. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his case. He didn't hurl insults at the soldiers or leaders falsely accusing him. He took it all on, and then he died, forgiving them in the process. As the Son of God, Jesus could have made it all stop, but he didn't. And you have to ask yourself, and I have to ask myself, why? Jesus allowed himself to be put to death because, as God's Son, he was the perfect representative of what God was like. Being willing to die when he had done nothing wrong, and then forgiving the people who did it to him, showed us what God was like: love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness. So Jesus died on the cross and then was placed in a tomb. Even though it was a surprise that religious leaders were willing to kill him, his death itself wasn't a surprise. Every religious and political leader died eventually, but Jesus' story was different, which is what makes Christianity different. According to one of Jesus' close friends, Matthew, some women were heading to Jesus' tomb after his death, most likely to give him a proper burial following the crucifixion. And Matthew tells us what happens next. Matthew says, "There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he lay.'" Maybe you've gotten used to this story because you've heard it so much growing up, especially every Easter, but try to imagine what it must have felt like for the women who were at the tomb. They had an angel show up and tell them that what happened with every dead person wasn't true with Jesus. He didn't stay dead. He resurrected. You don't have to be a scientific genius to know that things like this aren't supposed to happen, but it did. And since this event 2,000 years ago, the Christian faith has been built on the foundation of the resurrection, the foundation that changes everything. The resurrection is the most important building block. One of the most famous Christians of all time, Paul, said this in his letter to the Corinthians. He said, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." In other words, without the resurrection, everything we believe is pointless. Going from death to life is what gives us the point of what and why we believe. Paul didn't say, if the earth wasn't made in 6 days, our preaching is useless, so is your faith. He didn't say, if Jonah wasn't swallowed by an actual fish, if Noah wasn't on the actual ark, if Adam and Eve didn't have a conversation with an actual snake, our faith is useless. He didn't say that because those aren't the building blocks of our faith. Because whether science says the earth was made in 6 days or 6 billion years ago, it doesn't really affect our faith at all, because that isn't the point. What happened on a cross and the days following and what that event represents, that's what matters. As you continue to prioritize the foundation of your faith, here's what I want you to do. Build your faith on what matters most. As you prioritize what matters most when it comes to your faith and your future, focus on the main thing. The bottom blocks of your faith should be an event, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Here's what's cool about this. Hundreds of people said that they saw Jesus with their own eyes after he came back to life. There are multiple accounts of people who wrote about what they saw later. Jesus' closest friends and even his brother James were tortured, and many of them killed, because they refused to deny that they saw the risen Jesus. Jesus started out as this humble nobody raised in a small town on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. And within a matter of a couple hundred years, the empire had fallen and the teachings of Jesus had changed the world. Even people who don't believe Jesus is the Son of God are living in a world he changed. Because of Jesus, people started seeing the value of individual lives and not just people in power. Because of Jesus, the idea that there could be a good God who made a good world didn't seem like such a strange thought. Because of Jesus, history changed direction. The first followers of Jesus who saw the crucifixion, heard about the resurrection, then changed their lives and the culture that they lived in. As a result, they understood something. The resurrection was a real event that changed the world and the way we see the world. It's a building block that, when made into a foundation, changes everything. We join a long line of people, a legacy, who place their faith in Jesus because of the resurrection. So let me ask you again, what is the foundation of your faith? I want to challenge you to do two things with everything we've talked about today. Number one, don't walk away from faith unnecessarily. Maybe you've been wrestling with what we've been talking about. Maybe there's a Bible story or a passed down belief that doesn't add up for you. Maybe you've learned something in science class that's really tough to argue with, and you think it has the potential to topple everything you believe. Maybe there's been that tragedy or trauma in your life, but you've processed it, crisis averted, and now you wonder if you even need God. If you build your faith on the resurrection, that doesn't have to be the case. You can ask questions, wrestle with scientific evidence, and still keep your faith in place. Number two, build your faith on what matters most. Your faith in Jesus is based on something that he did 2,000 years ago with the evidence of hundreds of witnesses and friends who died defending what they saw. Not only that, you're living in a world that's been completely turned upside down because of Jesus. Culture shifted to reflect what Jesus said was true about people, meaning that when you head into your future, your faith can stand on the foundation of the resurrection that changed the world, changed history, and changed individual lives, no matter what challenges science or anyone else presents. When you build your faith on what matters most, you will build a faith that lasts. Science can't explain the person of Jesus, the life he lived, and the resurrection he pulled off, but that's what matters most. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainty you feel are safe here. If you're still unsure how science and faith go together, you're in the right place to have important conversations like this one. God can handle your doubts and the skepticism that science can sometimes raise. All we want to ask you to do is to give us a chance to talk with you about it. Maybe you're on the fence when it comes to faith. You're not sure you believe all of this, maybe even because of something you've learned in science class, in an article, or from someone close to you. If that's the case, it's okay. Please ask for help. Process what you're thinking or wondering. Give us a chance to have a conversation with you as you process the foundation of your faith. And as we close this series, I want you to know this. God is a part of how everything works, all of it. God is not outside of it or threatened by it. Science gives us the opportunity to learn more about God, who's behind all of creation. You and I can have faith in God and explore science in the world around us because we trust in Jesus, who created the world and changed the world through his resurrection. So when you head to group, let me ask you once again, what's the current foundation of your faith?